Now, on the night that the Americans killed Osama bin Laden, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband at the time, and one of the things he said to me was, I need, some advice around what this means. What does this mean, not just, for today and tomorrow, but what does it mean sort of geostrategically, geopolitically? And again, I spoke to a senior official that we both know, but, I don't want to embarrass her by naming her, to tell her that this had happened and said, the Foreign Secretary needs your analysis and what this means. And I said, I probably need it in 20 minutes. And, it can't be very long. And on her BlackBerry, she sent me 3 or 4 paragraphs of just really, really impressive analysis that it means this for Pakistan, it means that for Afghanistan, it means this for the US. She did all of the bases really, really impressively. And I remember thinking, that's really impressive.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to the latest episode of How to Diplomat. This is John, my former colleague, and I'd like to say dear friend. As he was telling us in that clip, he was the duty team leader on the night the Americans killed Osama bin Laden. He was the one who had to wake up the Foreign Secretary in the middle of the night and then coordinate geopolitical analysis across the Foreign Office in real time. He spent 3 decades in the British Foreign Office managing the UK's response to kidnappings, coordinating world leaders at NATO, and leading teams through crises that made international headlines. He learned something most of us never do: how diplomatic thinking, pattern recognition, systems thinking, clarity under pressure is exactly what you need in all walks of life. On today's episode, he's going to share the framework he used to stay unflappable when everything falls apart. You'll hear why your job as a leader isn't to have all the answers, but actually to see the wide-angle lens when everyone else is panicking. Why real currency is not what you know, but knowing how to make things happen. This is a conversation that explores how a fellow working-class Glaswegian council house kid ended up representing Scotland in Canada, and why that matters for how you think about influence, leadership, and your career. Hey, John. Thanks very much for coming on the pod.
No problem at all. Greetings from Canada.
So basically, you're the big boss of the Scottish office in Canada.
In Canada, yes. That's about the size of it, yeah.
And if you think about that boy growing up in Scotland, Glasgow, right? Could you imagine ever representing Scotland in another country and meeting the Queen? I mean, we can get onto that later.
Not much. I mean, I had a sort of classic working class council house Glaswegian upbringing. And actually, I spent all of my teenage years imagining I was going to be a Catholic priest, to the extent that I went off, to junior seminary. I was entirely convinced that that was going to be my path in life. So when it turned out that God wasn't, in fact, calling me, and it had been a cross wire, I was kind of a little bit bereft.
It was just the voices in your head.
Exactly. I was entirely rudderless, and I had no idea to do. When I think back to school, my favourite subject was modern studies, which in Scotland is kind of a study of politics and a wee bit of economics and a wee bit of history. I was really intrigued by the Soviet Union. That really kind of got my interest. And then years later, ironically, a couple of months after I joined the Foreign Office, the Soviet Union collapsed. So it was a perfect little arc for me.
Perfect. You went from school straight into the Foreign Office. Is that right?
No, I had a couple of years in an insurance company in Glasgow, and in the office canteen there was a big pile of newspapers. So I was just flicking through one of those newspapers, and there was an advert saying join the Foreign Office, see the world. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. Yeah, I might have a wee bit of that. But as you'll remember, it takes quite a long time to go through the process. You have interviews and tests and vetting and the like. So it took quite a long time. By the time I got the offer to come and join the Foreign Office.
Did you feel like you belonged? I remember I felt a little out of kilter, I think. There's a huge, I mean, it's definitely more diverse now, but I definitely felt every time I opened my mouth, I broadcast my difference. How did you feel? Did you feel you belonged?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, because at the time, the Foreign Office had this amazing scheme where they hoovered up, basically school leavers from all over the country to do clerical work. So I joined in a cohort of people that were pretty much exactly like me from all around the UK, and the Foreign Office would take rooms in the London Hostel Association. And so you immediately had a group of pals. You immediately had other DS10s in the Foreign Office. There was the sort of Foreign Office social club at the time in the basement of one of the buildings. So from that perspective, I absolutely felt part of it and part, of a group of pals that were in the office. But at the same time, there was clearly two different Foreign Offices. There was us at the very, very bottom of the pile, and then the senior Foreign Office, which was perhaps not as socio-economic diverse
Yes.
as we were. And this was brought home to me, I think, most colourfully by my head of department, popped his head sort of round my office door and said, I need you to come with me because I'm going to buy some wine and for this, mixer we're having at the department at the end of the week. And I was like, well, you're lucky you asked me, because I happened to notice this morning on the way into work, the odd bins had a sale on, you could buy 6 bottles of white and you get 6 bottles of red for free. And he just looked at me aghast. And he said, says, my dear boy, we're going to my wine merchant in Jermyn Street. So that was my first indication that perhaps there weren't that many Glasgow Council House boys in the Foreign Office.
I remember working for a person that you know very well, and he'd asked me to book him a table at a restaurant, a very, very, very well-to-do, high-class restaurant, which for one of his opposite numbers, or, it was a very discreet restaurant and meeting, which I duly did, only to get a phone call at the time of the reservation from him asking me where the fudge the other person was, and having phoned the other person. So I didn't realise there was more than one high-class restaurant of that name. I'd sent them both to 2 completely different places. Yeah. Never mind. You have done some extraordinary things, and I'm sure you would say it was more by accident than design, but you spent quite a lot of your career doing consular work and special cases work. And I mean, could you talk a little bit without, I know it's very sensitive, specific cases, but what would a head of special cases be looking at in terms of a day job?
Yeah, there's obviously a huge number of consular cases happening every day that are being dealt with by the Foreign Office, hundreds, thousands of UK nationals across the world. And sometimes, things go wrong for them, whether that's they lose a passport, they get robbed, they get ill, sadly, if they're with a loved one, the loved one may die. And there's a government response as part of that. And most of those responses are relatively straightforward. It will be an incredibly meaningful issue for the UK nationals involved, but it's a bureaucratic response from the Foreign Office, hopefully, that's, always entirely in keeping with what you would want it to be in terms of being professional and being sympathetic to the people involved. But there was a number of cases that were just that little bit more involved. And, whether that was the complexity of them, they were long running, they may have involved legal issues in the UK or, in another country. If it was anything that was high profile running in the media that perhaps couldn't have been dealt with routinely, had to, have a little bit of extra resource devoted to it. But I think what took up most of my time and the time of the team was kidnaps, at a time when a number of people were being kidnapped in Iraq and elsewhere, Afghanistan, the Middle East, even some kidnaps for ransom in Western Africa and elsewhere. And the difference with those was if you were dealing with somebody who had been robbed, that was something that happened in the past. Even in the sad situation of a UK national dying overseas, you were dealing with the aftermath of that in terms of supporting the family. The difference with a kidnap was they were a crime in action. So how the international response from either law enforcement in that country or advisory law enforcement from the UK involved in that case, it really required a cross-government response in some of those cases. So that took up most of our time.
And would you be liaising with the families? Would you be providing support to the families?
That was our main role. Our main role was to engage with those families and probably via the fantastic sort of network of family liaison officers that UK police forces have, and to explain to them what was happening, what we knew, what we didn't know, the actions we were taking, what was happening in the international space, that the context around some of these political kidnaps, for want of a better expression. So yeah, our main job was dealing directly with the family, or sometimes via a family liaison officer from their local force.
I mean, regardless of the outcome of those cases, some positive, some less so, they must have been incredibly harrowing for you and your team. You know, what's the kind of cost of consular work that people might not see or understand fully?
I think it can be high. I mean, as you say, the biggest impact is obviously going to be on the families themselves when they have a loved one in jeopardy. But that particular team and those particular roles, you were dealing with people who were experiencing that level of trauma and anxiety on a daily basis. So it's just human nature that that would, have an impact. And we were prepared for that to a certain extent. We had a sort of staff psychologist was available to us. We had routine conversations with them. Despite that, there was obviously times where it would impact on your general mood, and you could, feel a bit low, or even worse. And I think it was important at those times, for me to kind of either, rotate my team or stand them down, but also to look after my own mental health, I think.
Yeah. We were both sent to the US in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I think when we got there, I was deployed to Texas, to Dallas, because we thought there might be British nationals en route there. And you went to Louisiana, I think it was. Was it Louisiana? It was one of the first deployments of the kind, I think. We were still very much building that airplane as it was hurtling down the runway with no wings and no windscreens and things. So we were very much the advance guard in terms of shaping what those deployments would look like. And I remember not looking after myself and just hardly sleeping because I was desperate to find these university kids that had gone missing. And actually that really took a toll physically and mentally on me for quite some time afterwards. And that was kind of one of my few direct consular experiences. But what is your most vivid memory of that particular deployment?
Yeah, I think me and one other, there was just two of us, and we kind of arrived maybe about 5 days after the levees had broke, by which point the waters had receded somewhat. But we got briefed in the consulate in Houston, and then drove from Houston down to New Orleans. And I think that the thing that struck me most about that road was it was, the whole of New Orleans was entirely closed off. So it was law enforcement sort of barriers and gates all the way along that road that was stopping people going any further. There was, local authorities, there was US state authorities, there was federal authorities. FEMA was there stopping people going any further. And if you needed to go further, you had to have all the right documentation and everything else. And we rolled up to these barriers, and all we had on was a high-vis vest.
I know. Same.
And
Nothing else.
We had taken a cornflakes box and ripped the front off the cornflakes box, and using highlighter pens had drawn a Union flag on the back of it and put it in the front of our car. And the Americans were sure, and on you go. So we had got all the way into sort of downtown New Orleans, and I think the thing that struck me, I wasn't, I've not travelled much to the US. I think up until that point in my life, I'd only ever been, in New York for a couple of days. So this was a kind of real experience for me in terms of getting into the heart of the US and the heart of the South. And it was the devastation. It was a cliche to say something is like a movie, but it absolutely was. The roof off the Superdome, the streets flooded, nobody there. Everybody had been evacuated. I mean, it was extraordinary. There was some really difficult cases. There was some UK nationals left in the Superdome that we went to meet, and that was, a lot of heightened anxiety about how they were getting out and how we were going to help them do that. But also as well, there was sadly, a lot of dead bodies. around, including a small number of British nationals, probably, dual nationals. But we were involved in the sort of providing consular support to those families. So yeah, it was an extraordinary time in terms of looking after myself. I think it was only after I'd left. I think I did about 10 days there, and it was only on the return that they kind of the hugeness of it kind of impacted on me slightly. At the time, we couldn't stay. There was nowhere to stay in New Orleans, so we were based in Baton Rouge, and we'd go up and down every day. So I think one of my memories is just like eating badly. I think I survived on boxes of Cheez-Its every day. So now I never want to see another Cheez-It.
Well, we were exactly, that's just, you reminded me, all we had was a high-vis vest. And we didn't even have any proof that we were diplomats or we were from a government, other than the fact that we didn't speak with a Texan accent. I remember we'd figured out that these British nationals were being taken from that Superdome you're referring to the Superdome in Dallas, and we'd heard they were on a coach, and the Dallas PD had more or less set up an HQ, like a receiving, like it was just basically a mobile office unit thing. And as you say, we had no water, we had no means of getting food, and I was dispatched to go and knock on the door of this mobile unit because we'd seen they got pizzas delivered and see if I could chance my arm and sweet talk them into getting a couple of slices of pizza and a soda, because we had nothing and we'd no idea when we didn't want to leave just in case they arrived. So and obviously no mobile phones or anything. We had like a satellite radio thing, and that was it.
Extraordinary.
Fun times. So then you were, I can't remember if there was a role in between all of this, but you were also the team leader in the Global Response Centre. So could you talk a little bit about what that involved?
Yeah, basically the Global Response Centre is the Foreign Office's kind of out of hours monitoring centres. Obviously, events happen in the world 24/7, every day of the year. And just as the way of these things, when crises arrive, they tend to arrive, after hours, usually on a Friday or over a weekend or in the middle of the night. So we were that kind of first point of contact to decide whether or not we needed to stand up a bigger out of hours response. And it's kind of all the things that you would imagine that we were dealing with, principally anything that had a threat to life. So in other words, natural disasters, if there was earthquakes or volcanoes or tsunamis, we were constantly monitoring things like the potential for tsunamis if there was an undersea earthquake and the impact that would have on, various, islands and UK, overseas territories in the Pacific, those kind of things. But it was also, out of hours consular response. So, if something had happened to you, if sadly you had a loved one ill or had died overseas out of hours, we would be dealing with that. But it was also political level support, principally to the Foreign Secretary, but also other ministers, if they wanted to speak to their opposite numbers out of hours, we would set that up, listen in on the call, take the notes. So some of the things that happened on my watch, various. I remember particularly brutal earthquake in Latin America that had actually impacted, one of our embassies as well. I was on duty the night that the Americans killed Osama bin Laden. I was on duty when the Costa Concordia sank off of Italy. So that was the kind of level that you were dealing with, that you had to stand up then, a UK response to some of those issues.
And is there, I don't mean a script, but, obviously you're on high alert every time the phone goes. Do you have some sort of structure to follow or system to a procedure to follow depending on the type of emergency? Or is it based on your experience, which by that point was, 15, 20 plus years to know what to do?
I think, there was definitely systems and processes, and everybody there was well trained and very experienced. It wasn't just me. I always had great colleagues around me, and you could obviously activate the out of hours system for departmental duty officers. You could phone directly senior officials. I could even phone the foreign secretary if there was some issues that I thought required that level of input. As you say, if the phone was ringing, it was a good indication that it probably was something that needed that level of attention. And I think then the judgment was around, there's a sort of great Foreign Office line about it's probably easier to, ramp up a response at the beginning and then pull it back rather than not ramping up and having to do so later. So
And
yeah,
you're
you were
chasing
always
it rather than being on top of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was always better to stand up a response and then stand it down when you realize that something was going to be dealt with, maybe not as business as usual, but it was going to play out relatively routinely. So yeah, there was systems and processes in place for those kind of things.
Do you know, I think there was a couple of times at Post when we needed to ring the Global Response Centre. I don't know if that was during your time or not, but I always remember. Actually, have you ever seen Netflix, The Night Agent? It's very similar. It's very similar. You phone them up and, you could be telling them anything and they're really you can be feeling a bit, this happened. And then they're super calm, like, it's okay, this is what we're going to do. What qualities do you think make someone really good in that kind of situation in a crisis like that?
I mean, I think you're well trained to do it. You don't sort of go into it without any kind of training. Normally, as somebody that might have had a good sort of consular background, the Foreign Office really professionalized over the years and mirrored the kind of first response, emergency response model of gold, silver, and bronze and responders. But in terms of the qualities, and I mean, I think you're conscious also that you're leading a team. So you yourself can't appear to be panicky. You absolutely have to, whether or not you feel it internally, project calmness. There's something around a wide angle lens. You need to be thinking about, okay, I see what's in front of me, but what are the associated issues with that, either in terms of this specific issue or what it means for our relationship with country X, or what it means for the international system. There's a lot. I mean, you used a plane analogy earlier. My favorite analogy when talking about the Global Response Centre was one that pilots use when they run into trouble, which is aviate, navigate, communicate. And in the sort of global response terms, the aviate was, you need to be moving forward. You can't stop. Yeah. You've got a potential crisis in front of you. You need to be deciding the shape of it. You need to decide what the response is. And then I think the navigate bit is, where are you going with this? Is it small thing that may, have done by the end of the shift? Is it something that's going to run for a week? Is it potentially something that's going to run for longer? So you need to be navigating it and thinking, what does that mean for standing up additional resource? What does that mean for triggering the duty officer system in the relevant geographical department, talking to senior officials and ministers? And then the communicate bit is, you can't do all of that in the vacuum. You have to be telling people what you're doing. And the most obvious people to tell are obviously senior officials and ministers, but also, you need really good lines for the media. You need to have solid media lines. And then with my consular background, I would argue that even more important than those two groups, you need to be able to talk to and explain to the families of loved ones involved in these potential crises what it is you're doing, and how you're going to use the UK government levers to make that situation better.
I think there's a real skill there, because having been in both the crisis centre in the basement of the Foreign Office and, in the eye of the storm in terms of various geopolitical crises over the years, I don't think anyone who's not been in a crisis understands quite how much information is swilling around as well. And being able to pull out the pertinent information and make sure that the right people have that information and you're on top of it. And you, as you say, you can aviate through it and navigate through it to make sure that there's still momentum and the right people know what's going on.
And you've got that incredible Foreign Office resource behind you. On the night that the Americans killed Osama bin Laden, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband at the time, and one of the things he said to me was, I need, some advice around what this means. What does this mean, not just, for today and tomorrow, but what does it mean sort of geostrategically, geopolitically? And again, I spoke to a senior official that we both know, but, I don't want to embarrass her by naming her, to tell her that this had happened, and said, the Foreign Secretary needs your analysis and what this means. And I said, I probably need it in 20 minutes. And, it can't be very long. And on her BlackBerry, she sent me 3 or 4 paragraphs of just really, really impressive analysis, that it means this for Pakistan, it means that for Afghanistan, it means this for the US. She did all of the bases really, really impressively. And I remember thinking, that's really impressive.
That's why she is in the position that she is. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There's something about, and I've seen very, very good people do, is cutting through the noise in a crisis or whatever. It's like internally you might be kind of the Munchausen scream in terms of panic and oh my God, but you absolutely can't. And you just literally become very, very focused on. So, but you haven't just done consular work. You've done lots of other super interesting stuff as well. You were head of protocol or part of protocol for a while, working on NATO.
I was part of the team in protocol that did the NATO summit at the back end of 2019, the G7 in Cornwall, and then COP26 in Glasgow.
So I remember I had a great US embassy colleague who was telling me all about G7 Cornwall and how they thought that they had negotiated not to have the beast come over, the big armor plane, because the roads and the bridges in Cornwall just couldn't structurally cope with it. And then it sort of appeared. He was just like, oh goodness.
It was extraordinary because we picked for the venue, or rather the Prime Minister of the day, Boris Johnson, had picked for the venue Carbis Bay, which was this tiny little, beach village at the end of a very narrow road. And as you say, even the roads that were feeding into that road were pretty narrow. So you were trying to get 7 world leaders, all of their associated security and advisors and officials down these incredibly narrow roads. And at various points in the planning of it, you would think this is just impossible. I don't know why we've done it. But in reality, law enforcement in the UK is really good at this kind of thing. And if you have international partners, that are accommodating you as well, then you just kind of make it work in the final analysis. But there was a particular road that was a hairpin coming out of Carbis that I think we all kind of held our breath as the beast took its first turn at it. But they managed to do it.
Are there any other standout reflections from the whole COP26, G7, NATO that maybe change your perspective on diplomacy?
I think the thing is, I'm an absolute diplomatic geek. I love it. More generally in this conversation, I'm really struck that I've always felt kind of like, a round peg and a round hole. I like diplomacy. I like diplomats. I like being in this international space. And summits are often the kind of final hard yards of diplomacy. That's what they're there for. They're there, when the officials at lower levels and less senior officials and less senior ministers can't get something done. It's time to get mummy and daddy in, and they, have to deliver the decisions at these summits. So as a political geek, they are, kind of fabulous. This is my kind of Oscars, my kind of, show business premiere, that this is happening and I'm involved in it. But they're also, clearly, you've got to get all the moving parts right, because they're also theatre as well as diplomacy. They're also theatre. And the protocol of it, getting that right, getting people in the right place at the right time matters, because the press are there, and, any trip or slip immediately becomes sort of front page news. And so it's important to get that right. I mean, my personal reflections, definitely from Cornwall, one of my roles was sitting in the sort of police control centre, which was actually a sort of surf shop on the beach in Carbis Bay. And that was its day job, and had been turned into the kind of local police command centre that I was sitting in, and with a lot of quite burly police officers and, armed officers as well. And it was an entirely, secure perimeter, but, they would be talking about who's that down there, should we be approaching them? And I was like, no, that's Mr. Merkel, or, that's Mrs. Macron. So the value I was adding was, knowing
Yeah. Don't
just the leaders.
arrest that person.
That was a kind of interesting role. And then I think looking at COP26, I think for me it was, in many ways a return to Glasgow. I ended up living there for a few weeks in a hotel on site, and it kind of brought home to me, nice it is to be in Glasgow. But at the same time, we were bringing the world to Glasgow's doorstep. I think, it may have been overtaken now by other events, but certainly at the time, I think it was the biggest police operation ever in the UK. You had all these world leaders in a site, and you had world leaders staying all the way across Scotland, from Perthshire to, Edinburgh to Glasgow. So there was just multiple secure locations. You had to have lots of secure movements, but it was quite something.
What was your role as part of that? Like when you're at the conference itself, what is your job? Is it just to keep all the I say just, I don't mean that. Is it to keep the plates spinning? Herd the cats? Because I think sometimes, you often learn the hard way when you're organising these events. You're incredibly controlling, and so needs to be there, and that person needs to be there, and then they have to have the family photo, and they need this, and this. And you forget that world leaders are humans as well, and maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe they've got something else that they want to do, and it's actually trying to herd all those cats and get them into the right place at the right time.
Yeah. It was different. I was doing different roles in each of those, but at COP26, for example, I was kind of in I can't even remember what we called it, event operations center or something like that, which was basically, again, a sort of 24/7 room where I tended to do the night shifts actually during COP26, where it was a lot of sort of perimeter stuff and, where the protests, planning for the next day, making sure all the VIP movements were going to work. But also, COP has thousands of people attending as delegates and observers. So getting them in, keeping them safe. We were also in the teeth of COVID, or rather we were just coming out of COVID, but we needed to have sort of COVID protocols in place. You had to provide your test before you could enter the site. We were routinely wearing masks going about and in meetings. So yeah, it was another one of those kind of operations center type roles that you were, as you say, keeping the plate spinning.
How do you start planning, so without revealing any state secrets, but so say, how do you start with it? Do you start with a blank page? Say, right, we're going to host a NATO summit. How do you start planning something like that?
I think that the venue choice is a big one. Once you pick the venue, then a lot is determined by that. That would determine, the police force you're going to work with, and, early engagement with them is pretty critical. And again, they'll mostly be used to these big events. But I think if it's a summit with world leaders, you're adding a layer of complexity and a layer of security risk that isn't normally there if it's, for example, a concert or a football game or something like that. So you're just adding extra bits of jeopardy. And then it's the kind of dull business of planning and going through it. And, I spent quite a lot of my time, 26, planning, talking to Glasgow City Council. Where were they on this? What was their licensing issues? Did they need us to do as the people that were controlling that venue? You just kind of have to go through all the kind of admin of all of these processes.
Only involvement in COP26 was the organisers needed to sanction screen everybody. Delegations, because some of them may have been subject to travel bans, and that would have been, to talk about reputationally embarrassing as well.
Exactly.
In addition to consular work, you've done quite a lot of defence and security related roles, which inevitably involves building rapport and relationships with law enforcement and police partners. How do you earn credibility? My own experience is they tend to view us diplomats as a bit kind of, I don't know, superficial.
Yeah, there's definitely a perception of diplomats, and particularly people from the Foreign Office, in a certain way. But I think we all have, our particular currency. And in this space, the police obviously knew about law enforcement, armed forces obviously knew about, tactical responses in counter-terrorism situations. But I knew how government worked, and
Mm.
I could make things happen for them. They could make
Mm.
things happen for me. I think this was brought home to me. I did a couple of years on loan to the Department for Business and Trade, sort of heading up their civil nuclear exports and investments team. And I was in charge of civil nuclear exports and investments, but I had no idea how a nuclear reactor worked, and still don't. I've no idea what goes in and what comes out. And this was a great source of humour to my civil nuclear experts that were in the team, sort of sector experts that were advising me. But they didn't make too much fun of me because I knew how the UK government worked. I knew how France was likely to respond to an issue around civil nuclear investment. I knew how Japan would work in the wake of Fukushima and what that meant for the next phase of civil nuclear stuff. So, as I say, I think you're always bringing your own currency to some of these discussions, whether or not your currency is more valuable than the next person or less valuable, it tends to come out in the wash, I think. And you just, I hope, usually end up appreciating each other as professionals and a key part of the team.
That's led quite neatly on to leadership. You've noted a couple of times during the conversation that you had leadership roles over the years. What kind of leader are you? Would you describe yourself as?
I don't know. I mean, I suspect, I'm not going to be the best person to answer that.
Well, maybe what would you like to be described as?
I mean, I think you wrote a very good blog about this, about how you get promoted in the Foreign Office or in any role, and suddenly you find you're managing people as a kind of symptom or a side effect of the promotion. And I think that happened to me, and there's not a lot of training you get, and you just kind of slightly jump into it. And I remember one of the first teams I managed, I was kind of managing everybody in the same way, giving what I thought was, constructive feedback. But until one of them said in one of the chats, I need more. No, you need to give me more feedback. I remember thinking, that's fair. So you can't manage everybody in the same way. Some people will need more, some people will need less in terms of your kind of hand on the tiller, as it were. In terms of my kind of approach to management, I think one of the things in the Foreign Office or in any government service is you're probably managing people like you that are at least have half an eye on your career, and you're thinking your life, certainly in the Foreign Office, is chopped up into 2 or 3 or 4 year jobs. And even at the start of any of those jobs, you're probably thinking, what comes after that? So what I always tried to do when I managed people was have that conversation every time. We were having weekly or fortnightly catch-ups. Okay, I know you're doing this job now, but where do you want to go? How can I help you with that? What in your current job can I change to make you more attractive for the job that you're potentially going to do next? So I think if I have any particular approach, it's probably that. Other than that, it's probably just copying when I've seen it work well. I think at key points, I think in my 20s and in my 30s and in my 40s, I had really important line managers in each of those decades for me that kind of spurred me on, as it were. They each did a very similar thing in that they took me out of my comfort zone. I mean, I can be prone to my comfort zone. I can be prone to laziness if you let me. But each of those line managers said, no, you need to be doing this extra mile. You need to be doing those harder yards, and almost aggressively isn't the right word, but in a very determined way, shoved me into areas that, I wasn't particularly comfortable with. But I ended up getting the benefit from them down the line.
That's really interesting. I think there's something around, I was thinking as you were speaking, quite a lot of my latter leadership roles was just figuring out, as you say, you're leading incredibly bright, ambitious people. Part of it is just sort of getting out of their way, but figuring out a way that you can add value to them and their ambition in order to motivate them. But then, you go overseas and often you have a mix of UK team members and country-based staff. And the motivating factors for country-based staff is often very difficult. So actually being flexible and, figuring out how to add value to their experiences and inspiring and motivating them. And that can completely change depending on the context and the circumstances.
Exactly. And it's going to be different managing people at different stages in their career. It's going to be different managing, I think during COVID, when we all then kind of moved on to operating on teams, I get moved from protocol to go into the COVID directorate and was doing some of the international engagement piece. And it felt like everybody in my team was a new entrant to the Foreign Office. And I was very conscious, they were in house shares, they were balancing their laptop on ironing boards, and they were probably thinking, what the hell is happening in the world? So there was an element there that I had to be much, much more pastoral in the way I was managing. There had to be more kind of timeouts. There had to be more check-ins in terms of, their mental health and how they were, and, what I could usefully do to improve that. I think that's a good example where, again, for me, learning that it's not the same thing all the time. You have to absolutely adapt and flex your management style depending on the situation and the individual.
That's so true. I had a very similar experience, actually. When we were in the office, I was almost doing my own job and sort of just checking in with them periodically. But I had my own set of objectives, my own priorities, representing them, of course, and being there if they needed me, but largely leaving them to get on with it. And overnight, when we went into lockdown, all of that stopped. And most of my day was spent pastorally supporting them in one way or the other. It was very much focusing on them and supporting them because, as you see, they were locked in spare bedrooms by themselves. Yeah. Interesting. So you started to walk the Camino, and then tell me the story, because you did it once or twice and then realized you had a time deadline and you weren't going to.
I mean, for those that don't know, that there's any number of Camino routes across Spain. The main one that you think is there's the Francés, which runs from the French border all the way to Santiago. And I think I was coming back from my posting in Abu Dhabi. Good Foreign Office pals, Neil and Ian was coming back from Brussels. I can't remember where Neil was, but we decided we wanted to do something. Going back to my seminary days, I'd remembered the Camino and said we should definitely do that. But then I was busy and I didn't really pay much attention to the planning. I think Ian did most of it. So they picked doing the Camino del Norte, which is right on the coast of northern Spain, sort of along San Sebastian, Bilbao, Santander. So they picked that one. And it's just fiendishly hard. We got there on the first day, right on the French border at Irun. I had overpacked stupidly. I had a giant green backpack. And on the first day, you just go right up this huge hill stroke mini mountain. And at the end of the first day, I was like, I hate this. I can't believe we've signed up to do this. But by the end of that day, we were then dropping down the hill and arriving into the beach at San Sebastian. And I just felt an incredible sense of euphoria. It was the accomplishment of doing that first day. And we broke it into weeks. But I think the journey for me it's 800 odd kilometers. We broke it down into kind of 4-week-long trips that we did. The first one we did in 2017, didn't finish it. The pandemic got in the way and we didn't finish it until 2022. But as well as the physical journey of it, which was great, kind of, you arrive in the mid to late afternoon in a village or a little town and you dump your bags and you have a shower and you go out to the square and you have a beer or a wine and a bit of cheese. It's absolutely blissful, and it brings you back to literally the basic functions of life. All you're really doing is sleeping, eating and walking. That's it. What you have on top of that, whether for you it's a good walk and you're getting your steps up, whether or not it's a spiritual journey is different for everybody. And for me, it was kind of in 2017, I had 2 living parents. I didn't really have a care in the world. It was just a walk. By the time I finished it, both my parents had passed away. We had gone through the pandemic. The world had, was a very, very different place. And for me, the kind of continuity thread that went through that was the Camino itself, which meant that it was very kind of special to me. And something that I think, yeah, I will absolutely do more Caminos. There's different routes. There's some from sort of southern Spain up to northern Spain. There's the Portuguese Camino that you can start in Lisbon or Porto and go all the way up to Santiago de Compostela. Yeah, I would just say to anybody, go and do a wee chunk of it. You don't need to do all of it. Go and do a wee chunk of it, see how you go.
Because the Camino originally was a pilgrimage route.
It is a pilgrimage and still is. I think it's technically the biggest pilgrimage in the world, which is how I came to know about it as a seminarian. There's a number of classic pilgrimages around the world to Jerusalem, to Rome, but the really big one is to Santiago de Compostela.
When did you finish it, remind me? A couple of years ago.
I finished it in, I think, May 2022. In other words, just before I came to Canada. So it was one of those things that I knew I wanted to finish before I jumped across the Atlantic. And yeah, we managed to do that.
Was it instrumental in you deciding to leave? I mean, I speak to quite a lot of people over the course of this podcast, who are former FCO colleagues. And almost every single one of them has said, I never thought I would leave until I did. It's a really big decision to make. And I just wonder if that kind of spiritual, without sounding too cliched, whether that spiritual journey and that thread underpinned your decision.
It's a good question. And I mean, I think there's a couple of points to this. One, I think I was in my early 50s and I was running out of road in the Foreign Office. I couldn't see a natural sort of next role for me. And this opportunity to move to the Scottish Government come up just at the right time. But in terms of the Camino, and this really goes back to kind of a lot of the high profile consular stuff, and that taught me then when I was doing that in my 30s, the importance of what is and isn't important. When you're dealing with the threat to life, when you're dealing with people that have passed away, the literal stuff of life, and you think, how am I actually going to spend my days? How am I going to do this? So at that point, as I was kind of heading out the door of the Foreign Office and doing the Camino, I thought, no, it is time for a change. There's other practical things like, I wanted to position myself ultimately to go back to Scotland anyway. So it helped from that perspective. But absolutely, the Camino kind of solidified in my mind some decisions around that time.
What's the moment in your career that you're most proud of, or is most memorable, or changed you the most? All three?
I mean, there's lots. I mean, again, I'll go back to the point that I am a diplomatic geek. I've loved this. It's an incredible opportunity, and I don't think I've ever had any of the jobs I've done I haven't enjoyed. But in terms of proudest of, probably a technical one was kind of moving into policy work in my kind of early 30s, where I first met you. Up until that point, I'd been doing sort of service delivery roles, but I had always been interested in foreign policy, bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and thought I probably could make a contribution in that space. And again, a benevolent line manager took a chance on me at the time, despite having no background, and gave me a policy job where I met you and others in that fabulous big office.
I wonder if it's the same line manager that took a punt on me as well. He was obviously running a charitable organisation for ambitious Scottish folk.
We'll have that conversation offline. So I think that's where I got an opportunity to kind of spread my wings in the policy, bilateral, multilateral space that then kind of took me through a lot of the rest of my career, and that I was really grateful for. I mean, proudest as well. I mean, not necessarily proud, but when my parents were still with us, they came to all my postings. They visited a lot, and it was kind of great for me to bring them out to these places. Even, some of the more challenging environments. When I was in India, they came out a couple of times. And it was great to see them there. And it was sort of great, for example, to take them to Buckingham Palace to see me getting a gong. And I think anybody that's had an honour will tell you it's not really about them. It's taking the people with you. That's to see it happen. And my mum, cleaner, postwoman, classic again, working class Glaswegian background, and my dad an electrician, taking them into that environment was quite special and definitely a highlight.
Can I share with you a story that you told me that I've never forgotten either? No, this is a good story, I think. So you very, very graciously not mentioned that you organised the Queen's visit to the Baltic states. And I remember, well, all sorts of stories about you and from you about that, but I would share. But there's one, I remember you telling me your most memorable experience was, I think the Queen was going to do a walkabout in one of the cities. I can't remember which one it was. You said there was, I mean, this is maybe me over egging it, but you said that there was these very ornate doors leading out into the square or wherever she was going to do and her walk, and you could hear behind the doors the screaming, and the excitement of the crowd, and you basically stood behind her, and in my mind it's a very cinematic moment. The doors were kind of flung open and you were just overwhelmed with pride for the Queen and the government, and just overwhelmed by the excitement, positive excitement from the crowds as she went out.
I think that was probably Tallinn, and I think my kind of almost emotional reaction, it was because I'd been on a posting there. I'd done 4 years at the embassy in Tallinn, and the Queen was walking into a square that I knew incredibly well. I had spent many happy hours, sitting around it, eating and drinking and being with friends. And then to see that kind of collision between, my background and my work life, and then something that was clearly quite a joyful bilateral event with, a state visit, all aligned perfectly for me. The good people of Estonia reacting to the Queen was quite an emotional thing for me to see as somebody that had spent so much time there.
There's a lot of pride there for both the Queen and for the Estonians. Yeah. Wonderful. So my last question, if a young Glaswegian person, a Ouija as they're known in the parlance, came to you asking whether they could make it in diplomacy, what would you tell them?
I mean, absolutely yes. I think there is a quality about Glaswegians, particularly their approach to sales and marketing, if you like, their confidence. I think what actual Glaswegians would call gallousness is a great quality in many diplomatic roles where you are effectively front of house. You're either literally fronting up to meet international partners, or you're making that happen behind the scenes. So I would have no hesitation in encouraging Glaswegians of a similar background to me to try it. And I've been lucky in my role here to meet, there's a scheme called the Saltire Scholars, which is Scottish universities sending students out, in my case to Canada, to do internships and then, go on to the next stage in your life. And I met a bunch of them only a few weeks ago in Toronto, about 30 of them from a really mixed background in Scotland, some, really working class, who were doing great things in the business space. Some of them were interested in government. They were really, really keen to hear about the international and diplomatic space. So, hope some of them go in that direction. And so absolutely to the Ouija's young and old, I would say definitely.
Amazing. Well, thank you, John. I feel like we could have spent another hour chatting and gossiping as well, but we must draw it to a close. Thanks ever so much for coming on.
No problem at all. Loved it.
3 things struck me about John's approach to leadership in crisis. First, the framework itself, which isn't actually one I've encountered before. Aviate, navigate, communicate. It's deceptively simple, but it's the difference between reacting and leading. You move forward, you figure out the shape of it, then you tell people what you're doing. Most leaders skip the first step and go straight to panic. John didn't. Second, and this is the mindset shift, your currency isn't what you know, it's what you can make happen. John didn't know about how nuclear reactors worked. He still doesn't, but he leaned into his zone of genius, how governments work, how France would respond, how Japan would move. That's what made him valuable. In your world, that might be understanding your industry's politics, not just its mechanics. That's diplomatic, strategic thinking at work. But the real game changer for me was something he said almost in passing: can't manage everyone the same way. Some people need more feedback, some need less. Some need you to push them out of their comfort zone, Others need you to be pastoral. The best leaders adapt, they flex, they see the person, not the role. Here's what I want you to try this week. In your next crisis or next high-stakes decision, ask yourself, am I aviating? Do I know where this is going? Telling the right people what I'm doing? That's the diplomatic tactical approach. It works whether you're managing a kidnap response or a board restructure. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or suggestions for guests or topics for future episodes, email me at jennifer@howtodiplomat.com. Until next time, How to Diplomaters.